having been so young, and so he described it as it hurt him to think that a father could kill children his age, and he's there standing in the snow in 1929 as an 8-year-old. And so he almost had what you might call an obsession with it. It was a healthy obsession, but mainly just wanting to understand what in the world was the guy thinking. I mean, why did he do this? How could he do it? And but I don't really feel like most people think that I was obsessed. I was really just really wanting to document it, and just it becomes like a challenge, and you get all this information and trying to make it work, and trying to be really true to the story. He and I both, my father and I both, tried not to embellish it too much with anything that wasn't built on something that you could grab a hold of and say that came from somebody, that something somebody said and it was true.
Talk a little bit about some of the iconic images that are out there, one of which obviously was the portrait, which we already talked about. The other are the headstones, and I think the other one, I think there's a picture out there of the caskets of the family. There was a picture taken.
Yeah, I think that was one that was sold in the packet. It shows the caskets lined up, and they were all white except for the murderers was light gray. And in Meaning by Tears, there's so many more interviews that were done, after the first book came out, and like people who were at the actual funeral, and they walked past the bodies, and they were open there, that day. And there, one guy, he was 96 years old, very, very smart and alert. He had been a writer in the area, and he was 21 and had gone to the murders, and I got to interview him. And he was very clear about what he remembered and what he saw. And what was going on. There's like 5,000 people at least at that funeral. He had said when they decided to go, he and a friend, they were so far back to begin with. They knew that there was a funeral going on, but they were in a sea of people. And he said finally, they got up so they could walk past the caskets. And he said that the bodies looked like they were almost unharmed, after all the trauma that they had gone through. He said you couldn't really tell that anything was wrong with the bodies. And he said he had this real impression of the 17-year-old daughter, Marie. He said, I walked through the line, and when I got through, he said, I looked at my friend and said, now that was a beautiful girl. And
wow.
And then also I had the impression from the niece. She played with the children. She was like 13 years old, and her impression of going through and what she thought, and seeing all of her family laid out there, and then you have what the 16-year-old boy Arthur. He and Marion. He was on Marion's arm going through that day at the funeral. And the funeral was happening out there in the cemetery. And they said he got up to the caskets. They walked him up there, and he just collapsed. He and Marion both just collapsed and crying, and just about couldn't be consoled. And it's just, it's just such a sad and touching thing.
Are there any? I don't know. I guess we would know. Are there any valid theories out there as to why the son was spared the way he was?
Well, you've got my theories, and my theory is, Arthur was 16, but he was a big, strapping, strong farm boy. And then you had. And I'm sure maybe Charlie didn't plan on it, but his cousin Sanders Lawson, who was Marion's son, had stayed overnight there on Christmas Eve, and they were both there. Now, this was a problem of the logistics to get all these people murdered in the way that he did so quickly. And you don't know whether he intended to let Arthur, escape, maybe because that would carry on his line. But my theory is that when he realized that Arthur and Sanders both were going to be there, if they were there, I doubt he could have carried out the murders the way he did, because those two big boys, they would have stopped him somehow before he could have gotten it all done, I think. So he may have just allowed that one son to not be in the melee, and it may be that he wanted to leave a son, so that his seed would go on, and which it did. So,
can you kind of talk about the lineage there? I think you were kind of going that way anyway.
Well, Charlie's family, except for Arthur, was wiped out. Now you have Charlie's brothers and sisters, and so there's cousins that go down, and the family just gets bigger and bigger over the years. But Arthur did marry after the murders, and he married a young woman by the name of Nina, and they had 4 children. And then Arthur was killed in a car wreck when he was only 31 in 1945. And so the tragedy continued on. He died a young death, but then his wife, what we understand is really trying to escape the shadow of that murder. She took her children and went all the way across the country to California and started a new life out there, and far away from the story of the Lawson family murders. And so I have actually heard back from a few of Arthur's grandchildren. And what they say is, that they're doing well, that family, prospered out there. They're doing well, but they do want to maintain their privacy.
Yeah. So when I think of a place like Chicago, you've got Gacy, you've got all those notorious criminals. So, I mean, it has a rich history of things like that. For better or for worse. And there's other places, too, with the same deal going on. So, I mean, there are these haunted histories of different places. Now, I don't know a ton about, some of the things that have gone on in North Carolina, but I'm curious how notorious this is in that area.
This particular story?
Yes. Yeah,
they call my first book, White Christmas, Bloody Christmas, a cult classic. And because it seems to have a cult following. But there is, and I haven't really interacted with them, but I probably will here pretty soon. There's a Facebook group called the Lawson Family Murders, I believe is the way they title it. Okay. And there's like 1,600 members in that. And they say there's a couple more, and I haven't really ferreted them out, but with a couple hundred members in each one, that they talk about things, talk about theories about the murders and things like that on Facebook. So I think that's pretty interesting.
And in its own way, at least locally, and it has expanded, obviously, there's all these interesting mysteries throughout time, whether it's the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and things like that. But the Lawson family murder, even though we're pretty sure who did it, I mean, the circumstances around it, I mean, it really has to rank right up there as one of the most intriguing mysteries of of all time. I mean, at least in written history.
Well, I really think it is. It gives you so much, especially I guess you could say we were lucky to be able to gather this much, and we did it right in the end years, right before these people passed away. And almost everyone now that I interviewed is either extremely elderly or they're gone now. And you were saying earlier, anyone, people try to do things, secondary to this, but you can never go back now and interview those people again. It's finally aged out to the point, I think, that what we have is what we're going to have, without it being a secondary interviews like my grandmother told me something or something. The actual people that were there have been captured in the meaning of our tears. You know, I call them my voices, and there's probably about 32 different people whose stories, you know, come forward, and then I put it together with newspaper articles and whatever else I could glean, and then just put it together as one story. And so those people, you know, some of them, it wasn't real popular that they came forward and told their stories. So,
well, it's really interesting that you bring that up, because we had Kevin M. Sullivan on a few months ago, and he wrote a book about the Bundy murders, and of course this was I don't know, 15 years at least after the murders took place, and he was unveiling new information because he was talking to investigators from different places and coordinating things. And what he brought up was that, you know, that these guys remember it really well, but once they're gone, then it's all passed down. And that's kind of what you're talking about there, is that you're getting firsthand knowledge, but that's only going to go on for so much longer, and then nobody's going to have that source anymore.
Right. See, the 1929 to now, it's already been, you know, 80 years.
Right.
And or more. And so anyone that was alive that was an adult that we got to interview, you know, they've passed away. And really, so there's just no way to go back now unless you find something that they wrote or something. You know, it's going to be hard to get any firsthand information about it. But it's a treasure that some of them were willing to come forward and be put on the record about what they knew. Like one of the very first things that Hillary Hampton told my father, he said there was something going on in the family, and it was serious, but it was private, and he was not going to talk about it. And now we know what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. He knew about the scandal, but he was not going to talk about it. And then he passed away right after White Christmas, really right before White Christmas, Bloody Christmas came out in 1990. And then some of the others we interviewed, they started dying in like 91, 92. Stella Bowles died in 94. Ella Mae Johnson, I think she died, I want to say she died in 92. And so a lot of these were dying right after the first book, but we already had their interviews, you know, recorded. And then so I was able to go back to those interviews and pull everything out for The Meaning of Our Tears of 2006.
You know, one of the things that I wanted to bring up also is, and you've kind of dropped them in as the show's gone on, and I've absolutely loved it. You've dropped in some of the quotes that were, you know, either related to this, whether it was on, you know, like The Meaning of Tears or Meaning of Our Tears and things like that. Just some of those quotes are just so poetic, and it kind of makes me, you know, kind of go back to the idea that this whole thing seems so mythological, but it's not. I mean, it really happened, and I can't pound that point home to people enough. And does it seem almost unreal to you even to this day?
Well, I continue to have an appreciation for how much detail. You know, at the time you're doing it, you know, you're just kind of working on it and putting it together and everything. But as I look back on it, I think how amazing that so much came out so long after a murder happened. I want to just read a passage here from the little 9-year-old boy and what he told a CNA when he was 85, the year before he died. And he had never told anybody hardly anything about being in that house that day. But what he said was, what he told this CNA, her name was Renee Dudley, she said, Hassel said Charlie had this wild look on his face, and for a second he stood there and looked right at him. He said it was like Charlie was telling him to get out or get shot. he told me he ran back home, but he said